On the anniversary of my husband's death, the cemetery caretaker grabbed my arm and said, "Stop. You need to see what your son is really doing at the grave." Let me back up a bit so you can understand how I got here. For the last 4 years, ever since my Michael passed, I've become the curator of a private museum. His life's museum. This apartment, every single antique history book stacked to the ceiling, every dusty note, the permanent indent of his body in the leather armchair. Everything in here is a monument to him, and me? I was just the keeper. 31 years ago, when I married Michael, I was one of the most promising archivists in the country, a specialist in medieval manuscripts. But I put my tools, my jeweler's loupe, my ultraviolet lamp, in the deepest drawer of my writing desk and became a wife and a mother. It was a good life, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't mine. That morning, on the 4th anniversary of Michael's death, I was sitting in the kitchen, just waiting. The doorbell rang, sharp and loud, right on time, like always. It was them, my son, David, and his wife, Jessica. I knew their visit on this day wasn't about grief. It was about opportunity. "Mom! Hey!" David's voice, loud and way too cheerful, burst into the hallway. He gave me one of those awkward hugs, his scratchy cologne smelling like $300 mixed with a sour hint of anxiety. Jessica slipped in right behind him, like a shadow, her face painted with this perfectly crafted expression of sorrow. Her eyes didn't even look at me. They just scanned the bookshelves, sizing them up. She'd always hated the books. "Just collections," I heard her mutter once, thinking I wasn't listening. "Would you like some tea?" I offered, already knowing the answer. "Actually, we could use something stronger, Mom," David sighed, collapsing into Michael's armchair like he was trying on a crown that didn't fit. "Things are going from bad to worse." I made the tea in silence. I knew this whole song and dance by heart. He started complaining about business partners, about import fees, about that vague import-export venture that only ever seemed to import debt. It was Jessica who went in for the kill. Her voice was pure silk dipped in poison. "That container, Sarah, it's stuck at the port of Los Angeles, and the merchandise is worth a fortune, like $200,000. We need to make an emergency deposit or we lose everything, all our investment." Her eyes bored into me, cold, predatory. The look of someone figuring out how much blood is left to drain from an old, useless body. "We didn't want to bother you, Mom, especially today," David said, his voice dropping, faking delicacy. "But the situation is critical. We need financial help." I looked at my 41-year-old son, his face already etched with the wrinkles of chronic dissatisfaction, and I didn't recognize the little boy whose scraped knees I used to kiss better. The well of love and guilt they'd been drawing from for years had finally run dry. All that was left was ash. "I'll think about it, David," I said, my voice low and steady. "I need to check what I have." Annoyance flashed in his eyes. Jessica shot him an angry look. They were counting on an immediate yes. That's when he stood up, walked to the window, just like Michael used to. But on David, it was just a cheap parody. He turned, his eyes wet. The old trick. 4 years, he said, his voice cracking. 4 years since Dad's been gone, and I still feel like he's about to walk through that door. I'm going to the cemetery. I need to sit there alone, talk to him. A single, perfectly timed tear rolled down his cheek. And me, like a fool, I believed it. Or I guess I wanted to believe it. The hunger to see just a drop of truth, of love, in that man was so strong it wiped out 4 years of disappointment. That little flicker of hope in my chest is what made me whisper, That's good, David. That's very good." He left quickly, like he was afraid I'd see through the act. Jessica stayed for a second to seal the deal. "He takes it so hard, Mrs. Williams," she said, using my husband's last name like a weapon. He loved his father so much. After they left, the idea consumed me. I had to see it. Not to catch him, but to prove that tiny hope right. I had to see my son mourning at his father's grave. And it was that foolish hope that made me grab my coat, those 3 red carnations, and follow him. I had no idea I was walking not toward his redemption, but toward my own terrible and complete liberation. Samuel's hand on my arm was the only thing keeping me grounded in reality. His warning, "You need to see what he's really doing," wasn't a jolt of electricity. It was more like the slow turning of a key in a lock deep inside me, a lock I didn't even know was there. The carnations I was holding seemed to wilt in my hand, their vibrant red suddenly looking dull, almost brown. I didn't argue, didn't ask, what? Some part of me, the part I'd spent years silencing, already knew the answer. I just nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. He let go of my arm and without another word, turned and started walking, not down the main path, but onto a barely there trail that snaked between the oldest headstones. I followed. My feet moved on their own, crunching over dry leaves and twigs. The sound of our footsteps was the only thing breaking the heavy silence of the cemetery, a silence that now felt thick with secrets. He led me to a small hill, near a rusted iron fence protecting a long-forgotten grave. "You can see everything from here, and they can't see us," Samuel whispered, motioning with his chin through a dense lilac bush. And he was right. Our family crypt was there, clear as day, somber, majestic, a fortress of black granite that I'd always seen as a symbol of our family's honor and dignity. Now, seeing it from this hidden angle, it just looked sinister. Samuel stepped back, leaning against a tree, giving me space. He understood this was a vigil I had to keep alone. I grabbed the cold metal of the fence, the rusty points digging into my palms. I didn't have to wait long. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 figures appeared on the main path. David and Jessica. My son wasn't alone. He hadn't come to talk to his father, and they weren't carrying flowers. Their stride was businesslike, quick, with none of the hesitation of grief, no respectful pause at the entrance. David pulled a set of keys from his pocket. He fit a large antique one into the lock of the crypt's heavy iron door. A loud, grinding screech echoed through the cemetery's silence. The door groaned open. They stepped inside as if they were walking not into a tomb, but a storage unit, a common garage. The cold inside me, which until then had just been a gut feeling, started to become solid. It got heavy, dense. I watched, unable to look away, as if my eyelids were frozen open. A few minutes passed. A third person approached the crypt. A man in a long, dark coat, even though the day was mild. I couldn't see his face. He stayed in the shadows, but his whole posture radiated something slick and unpleasant. He didn't greet them, just peeked inside and said something brief. And then I saw the movement. David and Jessica came out, carrying things in their hands, items carefully wrapped in dark velvet, one long and thin, the other almost square. They handed them to the man. I didn't know what they were, but the way they did it, fast, with nervous glances over their shoulders, said everything. The wind, like a cruel messenger, carried snippets of their conversation to me. Their voices were low, but sharp in the dead quiet. "Flawless forgery," the stranger said, lifting a corner of the velvet. "A pro couldn't spot it." "I told you the master wouldn't let us down," my son replied, and there was a note of pride in his voice. "This isn't some cheap knockoff." "And the museum? Is everything smooth with the Art Institute of Chicago?" Jessica asked, her voice sharp with greed. "The museum director, that old fool," David chuckled. A low, dismissive laugh. "He's desperate for this 15th century Psalter for his collection. He'll swallow it whole and won't even choke. The main thing is, your people get the right documents to show it was a found treasure." Right then, my friend, something happened that changed everything forever. The warmth, that motherly warmth I'd held on to for 41 years, the one that made me forgive lies, cover debts, and believe in tears of repentance. That warmth didn't fade. It vanished. Instantly, like a lightning strike that turns a living tree into charred rock. In my chest, where the love for my son used to be, a block of ice formed. No, not ice. Something denser, heavier, compressed from disappointment and 41 years of foolishness. It wasn't even hatred. Hate is a feeling. It takes energy. This was just cold, crystal clarity, and a vast, heavy sorrow. They weren't just thieves. They were desecrators. They had turned his father's grave, my husband's crypt, into a smuggler's warehouse. Michael, who dedicated his entire life to the study of history, to preserving original artifacts, who hated falsehood in all its forms. And his own son, his flesh and blood, was using his ashes to cover up a trade in fakes. It was a sacrilege so huge, my mind refused to fully take it in. I didn't cry. The tears seemed to have frozen somewhere before they could even form. The man in the coat nodded, took the bundles, and vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. David and Jessica glanced inside one last time, fiddled with something, and then with the same grinding sound, they closed and locked the door. And they left, without leaving a single flower. I don't remember saying goodbye to Samuel. I think I just nodded at him and walked away. He didn't say anything, and I was grateful for that. I walked along the paths, past the crosses and obelisks, and saw nothing. I was on autopilot. I walked out the cemetery gates, caught a cab, and gave my address. The whole way home, I stared out the window at the flashing houses and trees, feeling like I was inside a glass bell. The world was happening somewhere out there, and I was in here, in a cold, soundless void. When I stepped into the apartment, I stopped in the entryway. The air was thick with the smell of books, old paper, and his tobacco, which seemed like it would never leave. I walked slowly into the living room, past his desk, past his armchair, past the shelves filled with the fruits of his life's work. It all suddenly looked like a movie set, beautiful, grand, but dead. My gaze fell on my own corner, the small writing desk by the window, cluttered with old receipts, my dusty, forgotten space. I walked toward it slowly, like I was performing a ritual. I drew my finger across the dusty lid, then pulled open the bottom, deepest drawer. It opened with a screeching protest. And there, under a stack of yellowed papers, it lay. A simple, unadorned wooden box. I took it out. The tiny bronze key always hung on a chain around my neck, under my clothes, next to my cross. A reflex from the days when the contents of this box were my life. I fit the key into the lock and turned it. Click. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark green velvet, were my tools. They hadn't tarnished. A small but powerful jeweler's loupe, a compact, metal-cased ultraviolet lamp, a set of fine tweezers and scalpels. 31 years ago, I had been one of the top experts in my field in the entire country. That day, in the cemetery, something inside me died. But something else, long buried, was just starting to wake up. The night after I saw what happened in the crypt wasn't sleepless. It was a cold, focused vigil. I didn't lie in bed. I didn't replay old grievances. I sat in the kitchen armchair, the only piece of furniture in the apartment that felt truly mine, and just stared at the toolbox on my writing desk. I wasn't plotting revenge, not in the hot-blooded way you might think. I was letting that crystal-clear coldness from the cemetery fill me up completely, pushing out 41 years of dust, of blind love, of making excuses. I was emptying myself out so I could be filled with purpose. At first light, I got up. There was no hurry, no usual morning heaviness. I took a bucket of water and a rag, and for the first time in years, I started cleaning my corner. I wiped away layer after layer of dust from the desk until the old wood grain reappeared. I repotted the geraniums. I cleaned the glass on the little bookshelf that held my books, not Michael's, modest monographs, articles I'd written before I got married. I looked at my name on the covers, Sarah Miller Jones, and it felt like meeting a friend I'd said goodbye to a long time ago. I didn't touch the rest of the apartment. The library, Michael's desk, his armchair, it all remained in its memorial neglect. But my little corner by the window now shined. It was my base of operations. The doorbell rang at precisely noon. This time, there wasn't a hint of yesterday's fake sorrow. It was a short, impatient, businesslike ring. They walked in without any ceremony. David didn't even try to hug me. His face was tense. Jessica looked at me with poorly hidden irritation. "Well, Mom, did you think about it?" David asked from the doorway, already walking into the living room. "Tea first," I replied, my voice perfectly even. They exchanged a look. Their eyes said it all. More of these old people rituals. But they complied. They sat down, David in his father's chair, Jessica on the edge of the sofa, ready to bolt. I went to the kitchen. My movements were slow, precise. I could hear them whispering. "She's stalling," Jessica hissed. "Relax. "Where's she gonna go?" David replied. "She'll drink her little tea and sign everything." I placed the tray on the table. I sat across from them in a simple wooden chair from my kitchen. Not in my usual spot. I poured the tea. David tapped his fingers impatiently on the armrest. "Mom, we don't have time to beat around the bush," he started. "We need an answer today. It's a large amount. We need to get it done before the banks close." I took a small sip. The tea was hot, bitter. It burned my throat, but the cold inside remained. I looked at them calmly, like they were two strangers who'd come to me for business. "David, is your business," I began softly, as if thinking out loud, "related to antiques?" David froze. His fingers stopped tapping. He looked at me, surprised. "What?" "I was just remembering my old work," I continued, just as calmly, staring into my cup. "Rare books, manuscripts. I was just curious what exactly you deal in. Import-export is so vague." A silence fell over the room. A second, then another. And then David burst out laughing, a loud, booming laugh. It wasn't cheerful. It was a laugh of superiority. "Mom, please," he said, catching his breath. "Don't bore us with your old hobbies. What manuscripts? We're dealing with serious stuff. Logistics, supply chains. Do those words mean anything to you? What could you possibly know about any of this?" Jessica wasn't laughing. She was wearing a small, pitying smile. She reached across the table and patted my hand condescendingly. Her fingers were cold. "Sarah, dear," she purred, "you should be thinking about your health. Don't worry your head about things you don't understand. We'll handle the details." She pulled her hand back and her gaze hardened. "Starting with the bank transfer. David's right, we need to go." They stared at me, waiting. There was nothing in their eyes but greed and condescension. They saw a quiet, senile old woman who'd suddenly gotten lost in a memory. They mistook my calm for apathy, my question for a sign of dementia. They didn't see me. They only saw a wallet that was being inexplicably slow to open. And in that moment, I understood that I had a weapon they didn't even suspect I possessed, their own certainty of my nothingness. I slowly placed the cup on the saucer. The sound seemed deafening in the strained silence. "All right," I said. My voice was even, maybe even a little too tired. "I understand you." The relief on their faces was almost tangible. "I'll need to review my assets," I added. Of course. David nodded, sitting up straight. "See what's in the accounts. Call the bank if you need to. We can wait an hour." "No," I replied. "I need time. I'll do this alone." I stood up, signaling the conversation was over. They left, annoyed by the delay but sure of the outcome, shouting instructions over their shoulders about which bank, which account, how to make the transfer. I just nodded silently, seeing them to the door. When the door closed behind them, I stood for a minute in the silence. And then I went back, not to the phone to call the bank. I went back to my clean, shining writing desk. Their words, "What could you possibly know?" still hung in the air. They'd made a mistake. They didn't just underestimate me. They forgot who I was. And I was just starting to remember. I didn't wait for evening. As soon as the door closed behind them, I picked up my old address book, a little black leather-bound one with worn edges. The yellowed pages held numbers I hadn't dialed in decades. I found the one I needed, the direct line to the lodge at Oak Hill Cemetery. The phone rang for a long time. "Hello," Samuel's familiar low voice finally answered. "Samuel, it's Sarah Miller-Jones," I said. My voice didn't waver. It was the calm, businesslike voice I hadn't used in 31 years. "I need to get into the crypt tonight. Can you help me?" There was a short pause on the other end. Not a silence of surprise, but of consideration. "Yes," he replied simply. "What time?" "When the gates are closed, when no one will be here." "Good. The side gate. I'll be waiting in 3 hours." He hung up. The first step was taken. Night fell on Chicago like a shroud. I dressed all in black, taking only my toolbox wrapped in an old shawl and a small, powerful flashlight. The cemetery at night was a completely different place. The silence was tense, buzzing. The almost full moon drew skeletal shadows of tree branches on the ground. Samuel was waiting for me by the side gate. A shadow blended into the brick wall. He unlocked the gate without a word and locked it again just as silently after I slipped inside. We walked along the empty paths. I didn't feel any fear. Strangely, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Here, among the dead, I felt more alive than I had in years in my museum of an apartment. When we reached the Williams crypt, Samuel pulled out a different set of keys from his pocket, not the one David had. This was his work set. Before opening it, he turned to me. "Mrs. Jones," he began quietly, and I could hear a deep respect in his tone. "Your husband, Michael Williams, he was more than just a man to me. A long time ago, when my family was put out on the street, he was the only one who offered a hand. He paid for my education, the history department at Howard University. He saved us. Everything I have is because of him." He swallowed hard. "I've been watching your son for 6 months, with disgust. I saw how he turned his father's grave into a meeting spot. At first, I thought it was just some of his shady business, but then I started listening, taking notes." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, dark-covered, worn notebook. He handed it to me. "It's all in here," he said. "Dates, times of the meetings, license plates of the cars that came, bits of conversation I managed to overhear. I did it for Michael, for his memory. I didn't know what to do with it. And then, yesterday, you came." I took the notebook. It was heavy, not from the paper, but from the weight of the betrayal documented inside. "Thank you, Samuel," I said, my voice just a whisper. He nodded. The grinding of the key in the lock sounded like a scream. The door swung open, releasing a smell of cold, damp, and dust. "The spot is here," Samuel said, pointing to one of the marble slabs on the wall to the left of the sarcophagus. "Press here and here at the same time near the bottom. It'll move." He handed me the crypt's heavy key. "Lock yourself in from the inside. I'll be nearby. When you're done, just open the door. I'll hear it." And then he was gone, melting back into the shadows. I stepped inside and turned the massive key in the lock from the inside. Click. I was alone. I switched on my flashlight. The beam of light pulled Michael's stone sarcophagus out of the darkness. I went to the wall Samuel had pointed out and found the 2 spots, almost unnoticeable indentations. I pressed. With a soft click, the slab slid aside, revealing a dark niche, the hidden compartment. Inside, several objects were wrapped in crimson velvet. I took out the largest one, placed it on the lid of the sarcophagus, and unwrapped it. It was an old icon on a dark wooden board, the face painted with stunning skill, with a deep, all-knowing sorrow in its eyes. The gold background glimmered faintly. It looked like a genuine masterpiece. I put my toolbox down beside it and opened it. My fingers found the familiar tools like old friends. First, the loop. I examined every millimeter. The brush strokes, the composition of the gesso visible in the chips. Everything was flawless. Almost. Then, I took out the UV lamp. In its eerie violet light, the old varnish should have an even, yellowish-green glow. And it did. But when I swept the beam over the folds of the figure's robe, in the places where the artist had used lead white to paint the light, I saw it. There, in the brightest spots, the glow was different, brighter, colder, almost chalky. It was the unmistakable fluorescence of titanium dioxide, its anatase form. This pigment wasn't patented until the early 20th century. To use it in an icon passed off as a 15th century work was an act of pure arrogance, a mistake only one man would make. In the silence of the crypt, his name came to me with a sharp clarity. The brilliant restorer who had been shamefully kicked out of the National Institute of Expertise 19 years ago for unethical copying experiments. A man obsessed with creating the perfect fake. Viktor Petrov. I knew the forger. And now, I knew what I had to do. With the ice-cold confirmation of the fraud in my hands, the night in the crypt shifted. The air was no longer about grief. It was about strategy. The name Viktor Petrov echoed in my head. I knew his work, his underground reputation. He was a sick genius, an artist whose only canvas was a lie. Knowing he was involved elevated David and Jessica's scheme from a petty family crime to a high-level forgery operation. Carefully, I rewrapped the icon in its velvet, packed my tools, and closed the box. The click of the lock sounded like a final period. I put everything back in the hidden compartment and slid the marble slab back into place. No trace. I turned the key, and the heavy crypt door groaned open, letting in the cold night air. Samuel was there, waiting like a silent guardian. I handed him the keys. He didn't have to ask a thing. The look on my face told him everything. He just nodded and led me out of that maze of stone and lies. The ride home was a blur. The first signs of the city waking up were starting to appear. I clutched Samuel's notebook in my coat pocket, feeling the icy resolve from the day before harden into tempered steel inside me. It wasn't anger. It was the precision of a surgeon who, after a clear diagnosis, knows the operation will be complicated, but absolutely necessary. I wasn't going to call the police. That would be too simple, too messy, and it wouldn't restore Michael's desecrated honor. The police would punish the criminals, but I had to destroy the lie itself, the web they had so skillfully woven. And to do that, I couldn't just snip at the edges. I had to strike at the very center. Back at the apartment, I didn't go to bed. I brewed a strong black coffee and sat down at my desk. Michael's death anniversary was over. A new day, a day of action, had begun. I pulled out another of my old address books, this one for professional contacts. I found the number I needed. Robert Anderson, director of the Art Institute of Chicago. The old fool, as my son had called him. I remembered him from his grad school days, a young, ambitious kid who looked at Michael with awe. I dialed the number. My fingers were steady. "Director's office," a cheerful woman's voice answered. "Good morning. Please connect me with Mr. Anderson. It's an urgent matter." "He's in a meeting. What is this regarding?" "Tell him it's Sarah Jones, Sarah Miller Jones." "I'm sorry. How do you spell—" I repeated slowly, enunciating every syllable. "Sarah Miller Jones, the wife of the late Michael Williams." The woman on the other end paused. My husband's name still carried weight. "One moment, please," she said, her tone now laced with respect. "Sarah Miller Jones." Robert Anderson's voice was just as I remembered. Deep, a little velvety, with notes of self-satisfaction. What a pleasant surprise. "It's been so many years. Please accept my deepest condolences. Michael was a beacon for us all." Polite, empty words. "Robert, hello?" I cut in calmly. "I'm calling not only as the widow of Michael Williams, but also as the former senior archivist for the National Institute of Expertise." A heavy silence hit the line. The meeting, apparently, was over in an instant. "I'm listening, Sarah." All the velvety condescension was gone from his voice. Only caution remained. "It has come to my attention that your museum plans to acquire a valuable exhibit soon. A 15th century psalter, if I'm not mistaken, from a certain private collection." Silence again, longer this time. He did not expect that. "That information is for internal use," he said, wary. "How did you—" "The source is irrelevant right now," I continued, just as evenly. "What's important is this. I can state with almost 100% certainty that you are being deceived. The psalter being offered to you is a high-grade forgery. But we had experts." Panic and outrage leaked into his voice. The preliminary conclusion was absolutely positive. "Your experts weren't looking for what they needed to be looking for," I said, my voice sharp as a scalpel. "I hypothesize that the white pigment used to detail the initials contains the anatase form of titanium dioxide, a chemical anachronism. That pigment could not have existed in the 15th century. Check it and you'll see for yourself." As I spoke, I heard my own voice from a distance. It wasn't the voice of Sarah the widow, Sarah the mother. It was the voice of Jones the expert, who tolerates no doubt. Robert Anderson was quiet. I could feel the frantic thoughts racing through his head. Reputation, scandal, funding, titanium dioxide, he muttered, dazed. But who? Who would be capable of such a thing? "I think you know the answer yourself, Robert," I said, delivering the final blow. "Remember who was expelled from the Institute about 19 years ago for getting a little too loose with copies? Remember Victor Petrov?" The name was like an electric shock. "Petrov? My God, I thought he'd drunk himself to death somewhere." "As you can see, no. His talent has found a new application. Robert, I urge you to stop the deal immediately and conduct a full independent forensic analysis before it's too late. Yes, of course, Sarah. I'm in your debt. I'll cancel everything right away. We must meet. First, do what you have to do. Goodbye. I cut him off and hung up. The apartment was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was buzzing with the tension of a drawn bowstring. I knew that, right now, across town, phones were ringing, orders were being shouted. I pictured David's face when he got the call from the buyer. I pictured Jessica's panic when they realized their biggest score, the money that was supposed to save them, had just vanished into thin air. Their easy money was gone, and I was certain their creditors did not like to wait. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Now it was counting down to an explosion. 2 days passed. 2 days of a tense, deafening silence. They didn't call. They didn't show up. I knew this was the calm before the storm. They were scrambling, trying to figure out what went wrong, trying to reach their accomplices, trying to save their deal. But I had cut the main thread of their web, and now the whole structure was collapsing on top of them. I wasn't idle. With Samuel's help, he came over under the pretense of fixing a leaky faucet. I staged a small revolution in my apartment. We moved Michael's massive oak desk against the wall. And in the center of the living room, where my husband's desk had reigned for decades, I placed my own writing desk. My small, modest, but now gleaming and clean workspace. On the third morning, they came. I knew it was them before the knock. Actually, it wasn't a knock. It was a furious, frantic pounding on the door. I didn't hurry. I carefully set down my pen, closed my notebook, and walked slowly to the door. David's voice, distorted with rage, joined the banging. "Mom, open up! I know you're in there! Open this door right now!" I turned the key. The door flew open so hard it hit the wall. They stormed into the hallway like two cornered predators. Their faces were a mask of fear and hatred. The condescension, the fake sorrow. It had all been stripped away, revealing an ugly, greedy core. "What did you do?" David roared, getting in my face, his eyes red and wild. "What did you say? To who? The deal is off. We've been burned. The buyer is gone. It was you. You ruined everything. You destroyed us." He was screaming, spitting as he spoke. Before, I would have flinched. I would have cried. But now, I just stood there, looking at him with the calm of a doctor observing a patient in hysterics. I silently turned and walked back into the living room. I sat down at my desk and picked up my pen. He followed me, still shouting, "I'm talking to you. Look at me." I dipped the pen in the inkwell and wrote down another license plate number from Samuel's notebook onto my diagram. I didn't look up at him. "Destroyed you?" I asked quietly, not taking my eyes off the paper. My voice, in the middle of his fit, sounded deafeningly calm. "Or exposed you?" David fell silent for a second, thrown off by my tone. "What? What are you talking about? What exposure? Have you lost your mind, you old woman?" "I'm just consulting," I continued, just as quietly, drawing a line from the license plate to a date. "Imagine, the museum finds my old hobbies very valuable, much more valuable than your import-export." And then I looked up. I looked first at David, then at Jessica. I watched as it dawned on them, as the disbelief in their eyes curdled into horror. They looked at me and they didn't see their quiet, harmless mother. They saw a woman sitting at her work desk in the center of the room, with a straight back and a cold, clear, perfectly calm gaze. The gaze of an expert delivering a final verdict. They saw Sarah Miller Jones, the archivist, the one they had buried and forgotten 31 years ago. "You," David whispered. He took a step back. All his fury was gone, replaced by a sticky, primal fear. You called the museum." I didn't answer. I just held his gaze. "You used his grave as a warehouse, David," I said, and my quiet voice filled the entire room. "You traded forgeries out of your father's crypt. You dragged his name, his legacy, his entire life's work through the mud. For money." I paused. "There's nothing left here to destroy." Those words hung in the air, final, like a sentence. David looked at me, and there was no more rage, just an empty, childlike terror. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish on the shore, but no sound came out. He looked to his wife for help, but saw only cold, calculated panic. Jessica had already composed herself. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a nasty, venomous resolve. She grabbed David's arm. "Let's go," she hissed. "It's useless talking to her. She's lost her mind." She dragged him toward the door. He stumbled, his glazed eyes still fixed on me. Before she disappeared, Jessica turned. In her glare, I read everything. This isn't over. It was a declaration of war. They left. I sat at my desk, in the silence that followed. I knew Jessica wouldn't give up. Like a wounded snake, she would twist and strike until the very end. I just had to wait for her blow. The blow came 2 days later, just as I'd expected. My neighbor, Mrs. Davis, called me, her voice trembling with outrage. "Sarah, did you see today's Daily Scoop? You better sit down before you read it." I didn't subscribe to tabloids. I walked to the corner store and bought the cheap, foul-smelling paper. And there it was, on page 3, under the screaming headline, "Widow's Grief or Senior Insanity." There was a picture of me, an old one from about 9 years ago. Next to it, a photo of David and Jessica posing as a loving, grieving couple. The article was a masterpiece of lies. An anonymous source close to the family told a heartbreaking story. How the poor widow of the great academic Michael Williams, Sarah Miller Jones, had never recovered. How she'd become a recluse, started rambling, confusing reality with fiction. And how, in her delusional state, she'd invented a monstrous story to tarnish the name of her only son and his wife, who were dedicated to her care. There were hints that I might have gotten mixed up with con artists myself and was now trying to shift the blame. The final jab was especially vile. It's possible the elderly woman, obsessed with antiques, is herself the mastermind of a criminal ring, and her accusation is merely a way to eliminate competitors. It was their last, desperate move, to make me look crazy. They hit my weakest point, my age, my loneliness. Who would believe a reclusive old widow over a successful young couple? I finished the article, folded the newspaper, and felt nothing. No hurt, no anger, just cold contempt. They thought they were playing chess, but in reality they had just flipped the board, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. I dialed Robert Anderson's number. Director's office. "Robert, it's Sarah Jones. Did you read today's Daily Scoop?" A heavy sigh came from the other end. "I did, Sarah. What garbage. I was just about to call you. My lawyers—" "Your lawyers won't be necessary," I interrupted. "I have a better idea. I think it's time for the museum to announce its new acquisition. Not the Psalter, something much more valuable." An hour later, I was in his office. Samuel's notebook lay on the table between me, Robert, and the museum's head of security. Calmly and methodically, I explained what every entry, every license plate number meant. I showed them my diagram. I talked about the chemical composition of pigments, about the artificial aging of wood. I talked, and they listened, their faces growing more and more serious. There was no more condescension in the director's eyes. There was respect and the eagerness of a professional who had scented a big prize. "They declared war," he said, closing the notebook. "So, they'll get one." He looked at the head of security, then back at me. "Tomorrow, 11 a.m. in the museum's main conference room, we're calling a press conference." The plan was in motion. They wanted to paint me as a crazy old lady for the world to see? Fine. I would give the world a show they would never forget, but it wasn't going to be the one they were expecting. The next morning, the main conference room at the Art Institute of Chicago was packed. Reporters from every major publication, TV cameras, the buzz of anxious chatter. The air was electric. Everyone was expecting a scandal. I sat in the front row. Next to me sat Samuel, in a simple but well-kept suit. He was as calm as a rock. Robert Anderson took the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming," he began. "The museum has called you here today for a very important reason. As you know, our primary mission is the preservation of cultural heritage, and today we want to announce a new, vital step in that direction." He paused for dramatic effect. "We are creating a new position on our staff, Special Consultant for Antiquities and Authenticity. It is with immense honor that I introduce the person who will fill this post. a person whose name is synonymous with impeccable reputation and the highest level of professionalism in this field. Please welcome Sarah Miller-Jones. A shocked silence fell over the hall for a second, followed by a few confused claps. The reporter from the Daily Scoop dropped his pen. I stood up and walked to the podium. I looked out at the hall, at the flashing cameras, at the dozens of curious eyes, and I began to speak, calmly, clearly, with no notes. I told them about titanium dioxide, about the difference in the glow of varnish under ultraviolet light. I wasn't speaking as a victim or a crazy old woman. I was speaking as an expert, giving a lecture. The hall went completely silent. And now, I said at the end, I'd like you to hear from the man whose courage and dedication to my husband's memory helped prevent a major theft from the public trust. Samuel? Samuel walked to the podium. He placed his worn notebook on the polished wood. I just did what I had to do, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And at that very moment, as every camera focused on Samuel's notebook, on the other side of the city, 2 unmarked cars pulled up to my son and his wife's home. They were just finishing packing their bags, ready to run. But the door wasn't opened by them. The door was opened with a detective's key. The trap was set, and the checkmate was about to be called. The press conference wasn't even over when Robert's assistant came up to me. He leaned in and whispered in my ear, his voice muffled by the new storm of questions from the reporters. "Mrs. Jones, we just got word. They've been apprehended. They were trying to flee." I heard those words. They've been apprehended, and I felt nothing that resembled triumph. No joy, no glee. Just silence. A deep, deafening silence that comes after a very long, exhausting noise. I nodded slowly at the assistant, accepting the news as a fact, like a doctor's conclusion. Robert immediately stepped between me and the reporters who were closing in. "That's all for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you." His voice sounded like a gavel closing a case. He took my arm and, ignoring the murmurs, led me out through a service exit, away from the chaos. From that day on, my life didn't change. It began. The first thing I did when I got home was throw open all the windows. I tore down the heavy, dusty drapes, letting the Chicago sun and air flood the apartment. The rooms filled with light. The dust dancing in the sunbeams was no longer a symbol of being forgotten. It was just dust, and it needed to be cleaned. The apartment transformed. It stopped being a mausoleum for one great man and became the living workspace of a woman. Michael's books stayed on the shelves, but now mine were right beside them. And my writing desk, in the center of the room, hummed with a quiet, active life. The phone rang constantly. It was auction houses, private collectors, other museums. "Jones," I'd answer, the loop still in one eye as I examined a photo of a Fabergé cigarette case. "Mrs. Jones, this is Legacy Auction House. We have the provenance documents. Very solid paperwork." I'd chuckle to myself. Paperwork is the easiest thing to fake. Is the maker's mark authentic? Absolutely perfect. Too perfect, young man, I'd reply. Carl Fabergé had an apprentice during that period with a slight vision defect. He always set the mark with a tiny tilt to the right. "Yours is straight as a ruler. It's modern work. Tell your client." A stunned silence on the other end. I'd hang up. Twice a week, I taught seminars at the Museum for Young Curators. I would stand in the bright, airy hall in front of a dozen young faces, hungry for knowledge. They looked at me not as an old woman, but as a source of wisdom you couldn't get from any textbook. "Never trust first impressions," I'd tell them, holding up an ancient reliquary. "Beauty can lie, history can lie, even science can be used to lie. But the object itself, the thing, it never lies. You just have to learn to listen to its quiet voice." I'd look at their shining eyes and understand. This was the true legacy. Not in granite and marble, but in passing on this knowledge, this spark of love for authenticity that I was lighting in them, just as Michael had once lit it in me. Today, after the seminar, I didn't go straight home. The day was surprisingly warm and sunny. I bought a bouquet of white lilies and drove to Oak Hill Cemetery. I walked the familiar path, my heart quiet and at peace. I approached our crypt. The granite door was sealed forever. I knew everything inside was in order now. No hidden compartments, no dirty secrets. Just peace. I placed the flowers on the cold stone. I ran my hand over the engraved letters, Michael Williams, and I didn't feel the sharp pain that had haunted me for years. Just a soft, quiet sadness and gratitude. Well, Michael, I whispered, everything is right now. Everything is in its place. As I turned to leave, I saw Samuel's figure in the distance. He was sweeping the path. He saw me, stopped, and gave a single, solemn, respectful nod. I nodded back. It was our silent salute, the salute of two keepers. I walked toward the exit, the sun warm on my back. I was no longer the shadow of my great husband. I was not the mother of my fallen son. I was Sarah Miller Jones, and my liberation was complete. Today, a few years later, I'm living a life I never thought possible. My apartment is a research hub, my phone never stops ringing, and my calendar is always full. David was sentenced to 7 years in prison for fraud and desecration. Jessica, in exchange for a lighter sentence, testified against him and Petrov's entire network. She's serving 3 years. They lost everything they tried to steal from me and were ordered to pay a $500,000 fine to the Art Institute of Chicago for reputational damages. David has never tried to get in touch. I've learned that sacrificing yourself for love can sometimes become its own kind of prison, and that true loyalty isn't protecting people from their flaws, but protecting the truth they try to destroy. And sometimes the family you choose, like Samuel, a man of honor, is stronger than the family you're born into. So what would you have done in my shoes? Do you think I did the right thing, turning my own son over to justice? Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you enjoyed my story, please give this video a like so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your support. You can see 2 more stories on your screen that I'm sure you'll love. Just click on one to watch. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next story.